Hey guys, tonight we're sliding into the surprisingly complex world of Renaissance handshakes, a realm where a simple greeting could make or break your social standing, ignite a duel, or accidentally accuse someone of witchcraft. You're standing in a cobblestone square in Florence, 1473, with a plume in your hat, buckles on your shoes, and sweat forming under layers of wool and brocade. A nobleman approaches. Do you bow first? Do you offer your hand? Which one? Should it be gloved or bare? Welcome to the Renaissance, where touching another human came with a 12-step instruction manual. You probably won't survive this if you don't remember that the thumb should never extend higher than the pinky in some courts. Oh yes, people were very extra back then. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and what time it is where you're watching. I love seeing who's drifting off from where. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The man approaching you in the square isn't just anyone. He's a Medici cousin twice removed, and you're holding a half-eaten fig. That's already one strike against you. He stops. You freeze. His hand starts to rise. Yours, still busy with fig juice. But this is Renaissance Italy, and handshakes are not casual gestures. They're coded rituals of power, politics, and paranoia. Back then, a handshake wasn't about sealing business deals or saying, "Nice to meet you." It was about not dying. Seriously. The roots of the gesture go all the way back to ancient times, but in the Renaissance, it evolved into a way to demonstrate you weren't holding a weapon. You reached out with your right hand because that was your sword hand. And by offering it empty, palm out, you were saying, "See, no dagger. Please don't kill me." Even the act of extending your hand came with built-in suspicion. Extend too fast, aggressive. Too slow, evasive. Not at all. You might as well be announcing you poisoned the wine. And then there was the grip itself. Firm, but not crushing. A limp handshake implied weakness, or worse, bad manners. But too strong a squeeze, and suddenly you were accusing someone of cowardice or trying to assert dominance. Congratulations, you just declared war with your thumb. One odd tradition that popped up in some Italian courts was the reverse grip, where instead of grabbing palms, you'd grasp the other person's wrist. Why? To double check they weren't hiding a little knife up their sleeve. You might think, surely people didn't actually keep knives in their sleeves. Oh, sweet summer child. This was the Renaissance. People kept knives everywhere. In sleeves, boots, hair, pies. Honestly, historians still argue whether the sleeve dagger paranoia was justified or just stylish drama. But the result was a greeting culture so cautious, it made a modern first date look chill. And it wasn't just about weapons. The very timing of the handshake mattered. Who reached first? That was a social chess move. Nobles expected underlings to initiate, but never too boldly. If you were of equal rank, the higher status person always had the right of first grasp. You had to read the room, the robes, and the rings to get it just right. Otherwise, best case, an awkward pause. Worst case, accusations of disrespect, social exile, or an unexpected justing invitation. Of course, regional differences made it even worse. In Florence, the handshake might include a quick forearm tap. In Venice, a subtle finger squeeze at the end. In rural areas, the handshake was seen as too urban and effeminate. Real men nodded, grunted, or thumped their chests like Renaissance gorillas. But one of the strangest hand traditions came from Spain, where nobles often did not shake hands at all. Instead, they placed a hand on their chest and bowed deeply. It wasn't about hygiene. They didn't care about germs. It was about honor. The chest hand was like saying, "My sword is sheathed and my heart is yours." Kind of romantic if you ignore the fact they probably hadn't bathed in 3 weeks. And if you're thinking, surely commoners just waved or said he. Nope. Most peasants didn't get within 5 feet of anyone fancy enough to shake hands with. Their greetings were entirely non-contact, a nod, a hat tip, maybe a mumbled phrase like "God keep you," especially if you smelled like barn. Because yes, even smells factored into handshake politics. Scented gloves were invented partly because everyone reeked, and partly to mask the smell of fear. You, back in our Florentine square, have now wiped fig juice on your tunic and raised your right hand tentatively. The nobleman pauses, maybe noticing your uncertain posture, maybe calculating whether you're about to sell him something. But then he nods, ever so slightly, and his fingers graze yours in a brief but loaded grip. There, you did it. You survived a Renaissance handshake. For now, the breeze curls around you as you step into the crowded great hall of a minor noble's estate, somewhere in Milan, maybe. The walls are draped in heavy tapestries of lions eating other lions, and the air smells faintly of beeswax, roasted boar, and human panic. You're here for a banquet, and you've barely recovered from your handshake with the Medici cousin. But before you can blend in and pretend to be a tapestry yourself, someone steps up beside you with a theatrical flourish of fabric. And oh dear, it's one of those sleeves. Welcome to the era of sleeves so long they could double as picnic blankets. In Renaissance fashion, suspicion came stitched right into your wardrobe. Those oversized, drapey sleeves weren't just an aesthetic choice. They were political, practical, and frankly, kind of dangerous. You glance at the noble beside you. His sleeve sways gently as he adjusts his feathered hat. It's big enough to hide a chicken in. Or, more commonly, a small blade. That's right. Weapon storage wasn't just a trope. It was real. The longer the sleeve, the more creative the concealed arsenal. Small daggers, slender spikes, even poisoned needles wrapped in lace. These weren't just fashion accessories, they were wearable paranoia. Historians still argue whether most people actually used these sleeve weapons, or just liked having them, just in case. The truth likely lies somewhere in the frilly middle. Some nobles wanted to be ready at all times. Others enjoyed the power of suggestion. Because if everyone thought you had a knife in your sleeve, maybe no one would test you. So what does this mean for your next handshake? Everything. You couldn't just grab someone's hand and assume all was well. No, you had to watch their sleeve. Did it twitch when they moved? Did it make a suspicious jingle, like metal against fabric? Was it oddly heavy? A smart Renaissance shake-a-titioner, yes, let's call them that, would make a show of lifting their sleeve slightly before extending their hand. Like, see, nothing hiding here. I'm safe. Also, admire the embroidery. Even this little lift had its own subtext. Raise the sleeve too high, and you might seem desperate for trust. Not at all, and people might back away slowly. There was a sweet spot. Just enough reveal to prove your innocence, but not enough to seem like you're trying too hard. Ah yes, the old Renaissance humblebrag. The obsession with sleeves went beyond weapons, too. Some designs featured hidden pockets, not for coins or keys, but for perfume sachets or religious relics. One bishop famously carried a tiny carved saint in his sleeve. When asked about it, he supposedly replied, "To keep my soul upright in dark company." Translated, he didn't trust anyone at dinner. And don't forget fashion competitions. In some circles, sleeves were like Renaissance NFTs. The more elaborate, the more social capital you had. Long, slashed, puffed, trimmed in fur. It was all about making your upper body a walking tapestry. One 15th century German noble was rumored to have sleeves so long they dragged on the floor behind him like a bride's veil. Practical. No. Intimidating. Weirdly, yes. You wouldn't pick a fight with someone who could blindfold you with a single arm swing. Now imagine the chaos this created for handshake protocol. If your sleeve covered your hand entirely, you had to preface the shake with a dramatic unrolling, which could take several seconds and several apologies. Sometimes, attendants or squires would assist. Yes, it was so complicated that some nobles outsourced the sleeve lift to other humans. You. meanwhile, are stuck with modest, merchant-class sleeves, respectable, but definitely not dagger-capable. A minor blessing. As you navigate through the room, you spot an elderly man with sleeves that glimmer faintly with gold thread. He's stretching out his hand, palm upward, fingers relaxed, but his other sleeve, oof, it droops down like a wet flag. You can't tell if he's just fashionable or about to stab you with a spring-loaded stick. The solution. The hesitant reach. You extend your hand slowly, eyes on his sleeve, waiting for the moment he lifts it. When he does, revealing nothing more sinister than a heavy bracelet, you both exhale in the unspoken ritual of mutual non-murder. The handshake completes, crisis averted, friendship tentative. There's even a written account from a 1490s etiquette manual describing how one should deal with sleeves of suspicion. It advises, in moments of meat, thou shalt guard thy breath and look upon the sleeve, for he who trusteth blindly may feast in Hades. A little dramatic, maybe, but it captures the vibe. Interestingly, in some courtly cultures, people began using the sleeves themselves as greeting tools. Instead of shaking hands, they'd perform a sort of sleeve dip, dip, extending the arm and allowing the sleeve to sway toward the other person like a bowing curtain. It was a silent way of saying, greetings, no knives today. Quirky, absolutely. But somehow still less awkward than modern elbow bumps. One final twist. Sleeves were also used to smuggle messages. Folded notes, discreet tokens, or even love letters were slid into hidden seams. So if someone reached out to shake your hand and slipped you a little paper in the process, congratulations, you were now involved in some kind of romantic espionage. Or tax fraud. Either way, spicy. So as the banquet continues, and you keep a wary eye on sleeves of all shapes and sinister possibilities, you begin to appreciate the elegance of simpler greetings. A nod. A bow. Even just walking away quickly. Anything to avoid the social minefield of flappy fabric, possibly containing vengeance. You're outside now, on a stone terrace overlooking a candlelit garden where nightingales trill with suspicious smugness. The banquet is still buzzing behind you, but for the moment, you've escaped the assault of sleeves and scented glove fumes. A figure approaches. Again. What is it with people in this century needing so much face-to-face interaction? He's smiling, arm outstretched, and just when you think you've mastered the handshake, he offers his left hand. Panic. Okay, here's the thing in the Renaissance. The choice between left or right hand in a handshake wasn't just a casual mistake. It could derail alliances, insult a baron, or suggest you were possessed by demons. The right hand was the clean hand, spiritually and socially. The left hand, often referred to as sinistra, literally, sinister. And yes, that's where the modern word comes from. Fun times. Using your left hand could be taken as a subtle declaration of disrespect, or worse. Unless, of course, the person you were greeting was also offering their left, then it was either a coded sign of solidarity, or both of you were confused tourists. Historians still argue whether some left hand greetings were genuinely respectful in certain contexts, or if everyone was just trying to cover for incredibly awkward moments. One theory suggests that some clandestine societies, guilds, or low-key heretics used the left-handed shake to signal membership. Sort of like a secret handshake, but more heresy-flavored. You flash back to a scene from earlier, a merchant from Venice, who offered you his left hand and smirked when you hesitated. At the time, you thought he had garlic on the right, but now you wonder, did you accidentally join a smuggling ring? There was also the question of injuries. If a noble had lost or injured their right hand, say, in a duel or while showing off with a mandolin, they were expected to clearly explain why they offered the left. Forgive the limb, they might say, showing the wrapped or gloved right hand as proof. No explanation. Everyone tensed. You could almost hear the swords unsheathing beneath the gossip. But that wasn't the only complication. Some courts developed coded hand orientations. In France, for instance, Offering your hand palm down could imply superiority, like, kiss it, peasant. In England, that was considered just rude. Palm up, that suggested vulnerability and trust. Neutral, vertical hands were safest, but even then, tiny wrist angles could betray you. Tilt slightly inward and you were overly deferential. Outward tilt, arrogant swine. It was Renaissance charades with your wrist. To make matters worse, glove etiquette overlapped here too. If someone offered you a gloved hand, did you remove your own glove first? Did they expect you to remove their glove? Sometimes, yes. Sometimes only if you were of lower status. One overly flustered diplomat once tried to remove both his glove and the Queen of Hungary's simultaneously, and ended up fumbling her sleeve into a candle. The incident is politely recorded as an unfortunate flaring of tension. So here you are now, back on this moonlit terrace, a nobleman's left hand hovering in the air like a silent question. You glance at his right. It's gloved, but not bandaged. He raises an eyebrow. He knows what he's doing. You take a slow breath and mirror his gesture with your own left hand, fingertips poised delicately. The contact is brief. Cool skin, no pressure. The man nods slightly and disappears into the garden like a bat in a rough. And now, of course, you're left with more questions than answers. Did you pass a test? Offend a duke? Inherit a spy network? One never knows with Renaissance handshakes. But beyond the confusion, there's also the philosophy behind it. The Renaissance was obsessed with symbolism, and hands were loaded with meaning. The right hand signified strength, authority, and divine favor. In portraits, it's always the right hand holding the sword, pointing toward heaven, or cradling a scroll of truth. The left was passive, worldly, or, let's be honest, blamed for every societal ill. If you were left-handed naturally, good luck. You were trained, sometimes with force, to switch. Entire treatises were written on correcting the wayward limb. Subtle, that said. There were exceptions. In some Iberian cultures, left-handedness was quietly tolerated, especially among artists or mystics. The idea was that the left hand channeled creativity and inner vision, provided you didn't use it to touch other people. Drawing a picture, fine. Shaking a cardinal's hand, hell no. Even religious imagery got tangled in the hand debate. In many medieval and Renaissance paintings, the blessing hand of saints is the right, extended with 2 or 3 fingers, raised in a symbolic gesture. If someone in a fresco was painted using their left to bless or to gesture commandingly, art historians now raise eyebrows. Mistake. Secret message. Mislabeled twin. The art world may never agree. Which brings us back to your latest brush with ambiguous etiquette. Was that handshake political, mystical, or just a lefty being rebellious? You may never know. But as you turn to enter the banquet hall, you begin to notice more people are gesturing with their left hands, a quiet pattern, a flicker of code in the tapestry of touch. And you, fig juice veteran of Florentine hand games, are just beginning to realize sometimes the most boring details, like which hand someone uses, are the ones hiding entire secret histories. You rejoin the banquet with newfound left hand paranoia swirling in your brain like oversteeped tea. By now, you've made peace with the fact that sleeves are weapons, hands are codebooks, and the guy next to you might be a smuggler because he offered the wrong palm. But as you drift past clusters of nobles exchanging greetings, another subtle detail catches your eye, something you hadn't considered until now. Wrist angles. Yes, welcome to the ridiculous and very real world of handshake geometry. Because in the Renaissance, it wasn't enough to just offer your hand. You had to angle it correctly, like you were conducting a polite duel with invisible rules. Too far in, too far out, tilted up, tilted down. Each angle carried meaning, and misreading it could make things awkward in ways even fig juice couldn't cover. Picture this, you see 2 gentlemen across the room. Let's call them Giacomo and Albrecht. They go in for a handshake. Giacomo tilts his wrist ever so slightly downward, palm at a steep angle. That right there is a dominance move. He's saying, I'm in charge here. You're lucky I'm not sending you to polish my goblet collection. Now, if Albrecht counters by tilting his own wrist upward, he's signaling deference. He accepts Giacomo's superiority for now. But if Albrecht matches Giacomo's downward angle, oh boy, power struggle activated. You can practically hear the lute player tense. This wasn't just social theater, it was deeply tied to how the Renaissance viewed the body and its symbolism. The hand, scholars believed, was an extension of the soul's intention, which meant every microgesture, grip strength, finger position, wrist angle, revealed your inner self. Bit dramatic? Of course. But when the Pope might be watching from behind a tapestry, you dramatize your tendons too. Even finger spacing mattered. Keep your fingers too stiff and close together, and you were seen as rigid, uptight, or trying too hard. Too loose, and people might think you were careless or unfamiliar with court behavior. The ideal? Fingers lightly splayed, like you're gently testing the temperature of blessed wine. Historians still argue whether this level of analysis was widespread or just something court etiquette writers invented because they were bored monks with a quill addiction. And the grip, it had its own language. A light grip meant, I acknowledge you, but don't touch my politics. A firm grip signified sincerity or aggression, depending on who you were squeezing. The trickiest grip of all, the silent squeeze and hold. That's where you gently press the other person's hand for a second longer than usual. Not too long, just enough to make them wonder. It could mean, we're allies, or I know your secrets, or I may have poisoned your meat pie. But what if someone gripped your wrist instead of your hand? That's where things get spicy. In the upper ranks of nobility, grasping the wrist instead of the palm was a calculated move. It said, I'm not here for pleasantries. I want control. Some military officers used the wrist clasp as a subtle power play during negotiations. And in certain regions, it even served as a veiled challenge. A firm grab of the lower forearm could be interpreted as, we'll finish this outside with swords. Interestingly, the reverse was true for lower-ranking folks. A wrist clasp offered upward signification. A merchant greeting a lord with a light wrist grip might be begging favor, or demonstrating loyalty in a more physical way. Of course, if the lord didn't like the presumption, he could always yank his arm back and walk off in a swirl of judgmental velvet. You, dear listener, have stumbled into this minefield without a map. As you navigate from one social encounter to the next, you start subtly experimenting. First, a neutral wrist. Safe. Then, a slightly downward, angled hand to a younger noble. He mirrors your move. Mutual respect. Victory. But later, you attempt the same with an older matron, and she arches one brow so high it almost detaches from her forehead. A lesson learned context matters. Even more absurd, some Renaissance etiquette books included diagrams of handshake positions, like awkward dance charts. One such guide, printed in 1521 in Bruges, labeled angles like the honest pivot, the baron's bend, and the graceful fork. Did people follow these guides religiously? Maybe not. But enough did that the anxiety of choosing the wrong wrist angle became very real. And there were factions. Oh yes, handshake-style tribes. In the court of Savoy, the palm, flat, school reigned supreme. Meanwhile in Bavaria, the palm, twist, was in vogue, a slight turning of the hand as a sign of intellectual openness. The Duchy of Lorraine. They preferred the gentle clutch, which sounds like a shoe advertisement, but was really a brief, tender squeeze meant to convey emotional resonance. Historians still squabble over whether this made Lorraine more progressive or just weird. So now, as you sip tepid wine and reflect on your own handshake evolution, you realize something quietly empowering. You're learning the code. Your wrist no longer flails like a confused fish. Your grip? Confidently moderate. Your angles? Well, you're not Giacomo level yet, but hey, you haven't started a war by accident. That's worth something. Besides, you've even developed a tiny flair a pause right before contact to let the other person show their hand first. It's like a little handshake poker. Who blinks first? Who flinches? Who's hiding a dagger in their cuff? All excellent bedtime questions. It's early morning now, and you find yourself wandering through the lower town, where the cobblestones are uneven, the bread is cheaper, and the fashion is far less likely to hide a weapon. The sun glints off dew, damp carts, and chickens mutter philosophical grievances nearby. You're surrounded by the hum of honest work, blacksmiths pounding, fishmongers yelling, and children chasing each other with sticks that were probably swords 5 minutes ago. But something's noticeably absent from all this bustling life. Handshakes. That's right. Down here among the working folk, nobody's reaching out to clasp hands. In fact, most people barely acknowledge your presence. A few offer nods. One grunts something that could be a greeting or a complaint about his goat. You, who just yesterday were calculating wrist angles like a diplomatic surgeon, now find yourself entirely out of place in a world where handshakes are not a thing. Among peasants and tradespeople, the handshake as a social greeting wasn't part of the daily script. It was viewed as a noble gesture, heavy with status, formality, and the kind of pretension that didn't mix well with mud and manual labor. If anything, offering a handshake here would feel like walking into a tavern and requesting a 5-course oyster tasting. The response would likely be silence or a thrown turnip. Historians still argue whether handshakes were deliberately avoided by the lower classes or simply never adopted. But evidence leans toward practicality. Why go through the ceremony of clasping hands when a firm nod, a brief tip of the cap, or a mumbled, "God watch ya," gets the job done? These folks were busy. Their greetings were short, functional, and extremely uninterested in your glove game. Besides, there were hygiene concerns, even by Renaissance standards. These were people who cleaned fish, sheared sheep, and occasionally shoveled things best left undescribed. Grabbing someone's hand was not just socially strange, it was actively gross. If someone did extend their hand in a village setting, it was probably to help pull you out of a muddy ditch, not to analyze your wrist posture. One popular alternative to the handshake among the lower class was the chin nod. A brief upward jerk of the head. Think of it as the original sup gesture. It carried all the necessary ingredients: acknowledgement, minimal effort, zero risk of a plague. Ridden thumb. You might see it between two farmers passing each other on a country road, or from a guard who recognizes your face but doesn't want to make it weird. Another variant was the forearm cross. This was more common among close friends or sworn brothers. Think blacksmith apprentices or traveling companions. They'd grip each other's forearms, not palms, in a sturdy, clasped arm gesture that meant trust, loyalty, and, possibly, shared goat theft. This greeting was functional and symbolically powerful. Connection of strength rather than softness. Interestingly, in some regions, especially among Celtic, descended, or Druid-influenced communities, people used hand on heart gestures or even simple toe taps as greetings. Yes, toe taps. Because nothing says, "I respect you," like a light nudge of the foot in a town where everyone walks barefoot. It wasn't about elegance. It was about survival. Less contact, less drama. Then there was the ever-reliable hat tug. If a peasant owned a hat, not always a given. Tugging it slightly downward as someone approached was a respectful nod, especially toward the upper classes. This wasn't just politeness. It was protection. Greeting a noble improperly could land you in serious trouble. Offering a handshake, that might be seen as mockery. Better to keep your hands at your sides and your eyes a safe few degrees below their face. And let's not forget the classic, "Please don't notice me" tactic. The half-turn shuffle. You see it everywhere among serfs and servants. Someone important is approaching. They pretend to suddenly notice something incredibly compelling about a stone on the road. This avoidance maneuver was an art form, executed with just the right amount of fake distraction and humble posture. It's like the Renaissance version of pretending to check your phone when you see someone you don't want to talk to. You decide to try something different. As a baker strolls past you, flour dusted across his apron, you give a light nod and a modest, "Good day." He nods back, says nothing, and keeps walking. Victory. A handshake here would have ruined that perfectly quiet exchange. Now, this might all sound like social coldness, but it wasn't. Among the lower classes, familiarity didn't need ritual. Bonds were built through shared work, mutual survival, and extended conversations over ale, not performative palm grabs, while nobles needed ceremonies to navigate their ego. Laden jungle, peasants relied on simpler, sturdier cues, who loaned you a donkey, who helped rebuild your roof, who didn't report you for poaching rabbits. Of course, there were occasional exceptions. In larger towns or mixed gatherings, ambitious merchants or upward climbers might try to imitate noble customs, offering awkward handshakes to city officials or wealthy patrons. Most of the time, this backfired. There's a story of one such merchant in Bruges who tried to shake a baron's hand, only to be ignored so hard that birds allegedly stopped singing out of secondhand embarrassment. Still, it's worth noting that while handshakes were rare down here, they weren't completely alien. During special occasions, festivals, guild ceremonies, marriages, you might see more formal greetings mimic the upper crust. A wedding, for example, might include a symbolic handshake between families. It wasn't natural, but it was tolerated. Like fruitcake, you glance around now, watching the marketplace swirl with unscripted humanity. No wrist angles, no palm poetry, just honest gestures born of dirt, labor, and the daily miracle of getting through another day without offending a duke. The absence of handshakes doesn't make this world colder. In some ways, it makes it refreshingly human. By late afternoon, you're back on the cobbled main road, half lost and fully tired of reading people's sleeves. The sun dips toward the horizon, dyeing the sky with that Renaissance gold favored in oil paintings. As you wander past an archway adorned with carved cherubs doing wildly impractical things with trumpets, you hear something very familiar, foreign accents. A diplomatic caravan has arrived in town, and already the courtyard is a hot mess of layered silks, bristling egos, and, you guessed it, handshake disasters waiting to happen. Welcome to the cross-cultural handshake conundrum, where Renaissance etiquette goes international and nobody knows where to put their hands. Imagine a French diplomat trying to shake hands with a Florentine merchant. The Frenchman extends his hand, palm up, an offer of grace and light flirtation. The Florentine, however, is expecting a mutual vertical grip with 2-finger squeezes at the end. Confusion ensues. One thinks he's being spurned. The other wonders if he's just been challenged to a duel or asked for money. Both smile awkwardly and mentally update their travel insurance. Historians still argue whether these regional handshake differences were deliberate expressions of identity or simply chaotic results of zero standardization. Either way, they created endless room for miscommunication. Every territory had its own micro customs, and travelers were expected to adapt quickly or risk deeply awkward stares. In the German states, for example, handshakes were generally firmer and more direct, pragmatic like their castles. A Bavarian merchant once broke a minor Venetian diplomat's ring finger by accident. The Venetian responded by switching to bowing for the rest of the year. It wasn't passive-aggressive, just passively wounded. In England, the handshake was not yet widespread as a greeting. Gentlemen preferred bows, hat tipping, or the occasional hand clasp if emotions ran high. Like after not dying in a just. When Englishmen traveled abroad, their hesitancy to shake hands sometimes made them appear aloof or even rude. One Italian noble complained that the English nod with the politeness of mules and the warmth of stone. Not exactly TripAdvisor material. Spain? Oh, Spain had rules. The Spanish handshake, when performed, was brief and minimal. almost like your fingers accidentally bumped mid-gesture. Any more enthusiasm than that was considered theatrical, which, ironically, was frowned upon in a country full of dramatic mustaches. The Ottoman Empire, on the other hand, brought an entirely different approach. Their hand-to-heart gestures were far more common than handshakes, and touching someone's palm was seen as overly familiar. Borderline offensive in formal settings. Many European diplomats learned this the hard way, earning polite side eyes and subtle tea refusals. Some Ottomans preferred placing a hand over their heart while bowing slightly. More spiritual, more respectful, and honestly, way more pandemic-friendly. Even within Italy, handshaking styles differed. Venice favored elongated grips, sometimes paired with poetic compliments, because of course they did. Meanwhile, Milan leaned toward brisk, no-nonsense clasps, followed immediately by business talk. A Florentine shake might involve wrist touches and prolonged eye contact, which everyone else found slightly unnerving. Then there were the truly exotic travelers traders from Africa, the Middle East, or parts of Asia. Their customs often bewildered Europeans entirely. A merchant from Cairo might clasp hands with both palms in a prayer-like fashion, then withdraw and bow. This deeply respectful act was sometimes interpreted by clueless Italians as a refusal to make contact, prompting offense where none was meant. A Mandarin scholar visiting from Ming China reportedly greeted his hosts with a deep bow and folded hands, which a bored French count thought was a charming way to hide one's fingernails. Close enough, I guess. Foreigners weren't the only ones struggling. Europeans abroad often bumbled their own greetings. One legendary incident involved a Portuguese envoy who tried to shake hands with an Ethiopian emissary during a formal reception. The Ethiopian instead expected a shoulder touch greeting, a sign of friendship and strength. The result? A brief, awkward tangle that looked like interpretive dance and was later illustrated in a very dramatic woodcut. And let's not forget the role of interpreters. Not just for language, but for gestures. Skilled aides learned to quietly whisper things like, "Left hand okay here," or "Do not touch the priest's ring unless you want to convert." These unsung heroes of diplomacy often saved entire treaties by preventing one bad handshake from spiraling into theological warfare. You now stand on the edge of the square where this chaotic multicultural handshake symposium is unfolding. A French noble bows too low to a Dutch trader, who responds with an alarmingly firm clap on the shoulder. Nearby, two German envoys shake hands so forcefully they both wince, then pretend it didn't happen. Meanwhile, a Venetian lady offers only her fingertips to a Spanish bishop, who freezes like he's been offered a live eel. It's all very polite, very awkward, and weirdly beautiful. You start to appreciate the comedy in all this. The handshake, for all its fuss, was never really about touch. It was about saying, "I see you, I respect you, and I am trying, not very successfully, but trying to speak your language without words." So as you watch a Scottish diplomat attempt what can only be described as a handshake curtsy hybrid, you realize that in a world full of sharp edges, confusing customs, and wildly different ideas about sleeves, the real handshake was the attempt itself, the flailing, fumbling effort to meet halfway, the comedy of goodwill. You're back indoors now, thankfully. The International Handshake Summit has worn you down to the emotional level of a bruised peer. The candles are lit, casting flickering shadows on the stone walls, and someone in the distance is playing a lute with suspicious confidence. But tonight's focus isn't on hands themselves. It's on gloves. Oh yes, gloves. Those seemingly innocent fashion accessories that, in Renaissance handshake etiquette, were anything but simple. Welcome to the glove games. A world where what you did with your gloves during a handshake spoke volumes. It was the Morse code of the nobility. Miss a beat? You might as well insult someone's grandmother and punch a pope. So let's begin with the golden rule. Gloves off meant respect. If you approach someone of equal or higher status, It was expected that you'd remove your glove before offering your hand. This was a sign of humility, openness, and, you guessed it again, a lack of concealed weaponry. But there was nuance. If you removed just one glove, that was usually enough. 2 gloves. That could mean excessive formality flirtation, or in some cases, that you were very cold and extremely nervous. Keeping both gloves on while initiating a handshake, bold, disrespectful, unless you were royalty or had a really good excuse like, I'm recovering from plague boils. And then there was the glove removal flourish. Oh, the drama. In some circles, nobles prided themselves on removing their gloves with a single, smooth tug, preferably while maintaining eye contact. Too quick, and it looked rushed. Too slow, and it became suggestive. One poor courtier in Burgundy once took so long to remove his glove during an audience that everyone assumed he was proposing. He was not. Historians still argue whether glove etiquette emerged from practicality, fashion, or sheer boredom. Most agree it started as a way to avoid the transfer of unpleasant substances, dirt, sweat, rat-based illness, but quickly evolved into a class signal. Only the wealthy had gloves fine enough to be removed and displayed like sacred scrolls. Peasants had mittens made of goat fur and shame. Let's not forget the material mattered too. Velvet gloves said, I'm important, soft, and possibly broke now. Leather gloves meant practicality, often worn by knights and men of action. Silk gloves, a touch flamboyant. Chainmail gloves, definitely not handshake friendly. One knight's attempt to clasp hands while wearing a gauntlet is still whispered about in jest across Tuscany. The noble he greeted required 3 weeks of hand therapy and a new knuckle. And what if someone offered their gloved hand to you? That was layered. If you were of lower status, you were expected to accept it without complaint. To hesitate might be seen as defiance. If you were of equal status, you could subtly raise your eyebrows or offer a bare hand in return, a silent challenge to remove theirs. Occasionally, this back and forth turned into a weird glove duel where both parties stood frozen, silently waiting to see who would give in and disrobe their palm first. Think of it like a medieval staring contest, but with fabric and pride. The church had opinions too. Of course they did. Bishops often wore symbolic gloves during ceremonial greetings and were not expected to remove them, unless they were greeting someone of very high holy rank. One papal emissary once refused to shake a king's bare hand because he had not removed his glove first. The incident made headlines. Well, scroll margins for months. Now here's a quirky little tidbit: gloves were often scented. Yes, nobles would soak or dust their gloves with perfumes made from lavender, cloves, even crushed rose petals. It was a sign of refinement, and a sneaky way to mask the musk of unwashed limbs. A handshake with a perfumed glove might leave your hand subtly fragrant for the rest of the evening. Flirty, maybe. Passive, aggressively hygienic. Absolutely. You take a moment now to inspect your own gloves. Modest leather, lightly worn. Nothing perfumed. Just enough for practical warmth and minimal offense. As you stroll through the quieter chambers of the estate, you practice. Glove off in one fluid motion, hand extended. Wrist at a neutral angle. Nailed it. You try again. This time removing both gloves slowly and tucking them beneath your arm like a well-read diplomat. Stylish. Possibly mysterious. Then, just as you're getting cocky, a noblewoman appears at the corridor's end. She's wearing the kind of gown that suggests she owns 3 vineyards and a small militia. She raises her gloved hand slowly, palm inward. This is not a handshake offer. This is the glove hover. A Renaissance power move where the glove is left on, the hand is slightly extended, and you're expected to do something. So what do? Remove your glove and offer your bare hand, risking being ignored. Offer a bow and pretend not to notice. Or, the boldest option, gently touch her gloved fingers with your own gloved hand, matching gesture for gesture. You choose the last, your fingers meet lightly, glove to glove. A soft press, no grip, just a symbolic acknowledgement. She nods, just enough to signal that you've passed whatever strange glove exam this was. She disappears into the dark like a perfume, scented shadow. And you, proud glove tactician, realize that Renaissance greetings weren't just about touch. They were about theater, costume, scented leather strategy. The handshake was never alone. It was accompanied by a cast of accessories, a wardrobe of meaning, and sometimes a puff of bergamot on your thumb. The hall has emptied now, except for the soft hiss of torches and the occasional noble muttering to themselves about cheese. You found a quieter wing of the estate, where the walls are lined with dusty tapestries and your footsteps echo like they're unsure if they belong here. And just when you start to think your handshake adventure might be done for the evening, bam, you're cornered by a noble with the posture of a statue and the grip of a blacksmith. Welcome to the world of wrist grabs and power plays. See, by the mid-Renaissance, the handshake wasn't always a handshake. Sometimes, especially among powerful men, it mutated into a much more aggressive gesture. The wrist clasp, this wasn't about mutual respect. It was about control, status, muscle tone, and maybe a pinch of vengeance left over from a botched inheritance. The wrist grab was the kind of greeting that skipped the formalities and jumped straight into subtext. No delicate fingers or elegant gloved touches here. This was you reaching out and seizing someone's wrist like you were about to arm wrestle, except the prize was dignity. Used primarily among men of roughly equal or competing status, the wrist clasp was designed to say, I see you. I don't trust you, but let's pretend we're friends. It had just enough warmth to pass as polite and just enough tension to make your pulse spike. Historians still debate whether this gesture originated on the battlefield or the negotiating table. Some argue it was a knightly greeting born out of practicality. When you're wearing chainmail and carrying weapons, a full palm clasp is difficult. Others claim it evolved from Roman traditions of gripping the forearm as a sign of alliance. Whatever its source, by the 1500s, it had become the go-to move for high-stakes social standoffs, and there were levels. A grip on the wrist proper, directly over the joint, was firm and neutral. A hand that slid up the forearm, that was veering into domination territory. A squeeze, that added a threat. A double-handed wrist grip with eye contact, that was either the start of a coup or the end of a marriage. There's one famous incident, recorded in the journal of a Sienese courtier, where a handshake between two dukes escalated into an actual brawl because one of them held the other's wrist 2 seconds too long. The chronicle simply says, and thus, the poultry feast was interrupted by a duel in the rose garden. Sometimes, a wrist grab wasn't even initiated, it was enforced. You, an underling, offer your hand. The noble you're greeting ignores your palm and grabs your wrist instead. That move alone repositioned the entire social dynamic. You thought you were participating in a greeting. Surprise, you've just been overruled. And if you tried to resist the wrist grab, oof. Bad idea. Pulling back could be seen as open defiance, tantamount to slapping someone with a glove full of bees. You had to let it happen, then maybe regain ground with a carefully timed shoulder pat later. Social judo. Now, you might think the wrist grab was exclusive to men. For the most part, yes. But in rare situations, women of high status would employ it too, often in defense. Imagine a noblewoman receiving an unwanted handshake from an overeager courtier. Rather than retreating, she might grab his wrist first, a way of flipping the power dynamic and saying, "No, darling, I lead this dance." It was dramatic, it was risky, and it absolutely worked. There's a delightful fringe account from a Polish court where a princess, known for her terrifying composure, used the wrist grab on every suitor who tried to kiss her hand. They say she had the grip strength of a falcon and the social confidence of a goddess. One German noble fainted. She married a poet instead. Now you, weary handshake scholar, find yourself face to face with a broad-shouldered noble whose family crest involves at least 3 bears. He thrusts out his hand, and before you can prepare, boom, your wrist is in his grasp. It's controlled. Just shy of painful. What do? You maintain eye contact. No flinching. You let your hand rest lightly against his wrist in a neutral counter. Grip. Just enough to say, I see your bear, and I raise you a duck. His grip loosens ever so slightly. The corners of his mouth twitch, and just like that, the balance shifts. No one wins. No one loses. The handshake ends. And honestly, you're a little proud. This wasn't the end of power. Handshakes, by the way. Variants would continue into later centuries. Military salutes, secret fraternity grips, even business handshakes meant to imply, I've crushed competitors for breakfast. But in the Renaissance, the wrist grab had its golden moment, right between a dagger in the sleeve and a bow from the hip. It reminds you that even the most mundane gesture can become a battlefield when you put it in a hall of egos. You don't need swords or armies to fight. You just need a wrist, a grip, and the nerve to squeeze back when it counts. The corridor opens onto a shaded courtyard where the air is sweet with lavender and the low murmur of a nearby fountain. You're almost relaxed until you spot a group of well-dressed ladies gliding across the stones like sentient chandeliers. They chat quietly, fans fluttering, their laughter delicate as spun sugar. And you, poor soul, have just remembered you still haven't figured out how women did handshakes in the Renaissance. Spoiler, they mostly didn't. In a society obsessed with hierarchy, purity, and what women shouldn't be doing, female greetings were an entirely separate category from their male counterparts. While men were out their wrist, grabbing each other into power struggles, women were expected to navigate a delicate minefield of finger taps, curtsies, and strategic ignoring, because a handshake with a lady, scandalous. Unless, of course, it was done precisely right. You approach cautiously, the lady nearest to you, gowned in enough satin to curtain a theater, offers a subtle dip of her head. No hand extended. That's your first clue. Renaissance women rarely initiated handshakes unless they were of equal or higher status than the man in question. To do otherwise was to invite whispers, side eyes, or worse, assumptions. Historians still argue whether women were actively discouraged from handshakes or if it simply wasn't part of their world. Many etiquette books of the time barely mention female greetings at all, as if women floated through society on clouds of perfume and silence. In reality, they were just playing a different game, one with fewer handshakes and more body language than a mime convention. For noblewomen, the default greeting was a curtsy, a graceful dip of the knees while maintaining eye contact and balance. Bonus points if your dress didn't tip over a candelabra. If a handshake was deemed necessary, say, in a diplomatic setting, it had to be performed with the utmost delicacy. Think fingertips only, no palm contact, no grip. The lady might extend just 2 fingers, like she's offering you a petal to admire. You're not supposed to squeeze. You're barely supposed to touch. And if you dared to go in with a full handshake, that was interpreted as either a romantic advance, a grave insult, or a comedic misunderstanding worthy of sonetry. Of course, women among themselves had their own set of codes. Close friends or sisters might grasp hands gently, especially in private settings. But again, these weren't the firm, wrist-bending affairs of the male court. They were fleeting, symbolic, less about power and more about solidarity, shared secrets, or emotional support. A light hand clasp during a prayer, a quick touch before dancing. These were their handshakes. Then there were the fans. Oh yes, the folding fan was more than just a cooling device. It was a social toolkit. A woman could wave hello, flutter goodbye, or hide half her face in a gesture. That meant, I do not wish to be seen acknowledging you, good sir. A closed fan tapped lightly against the palm could replace a handshake entirely. One Spanish countess famously never shook hands with anyone. She simply pressed her fan to her chest and nodded. People bowed in return, unsure if they'd just been blessed or dismissed. Gloves complicated things even further. For women, gloves were both fashion and armor. Unlike men, who might remove them to demonstrate openness, noblewomen often kept gloves on as a sign of propriety. If they did remove a glove to greet you, that was significant. That meant you mattered. Or that they were about to poison you with a finger ring. Renaissance etiquette always keep you guessing. Let's not forget the role of chaperones. Women of high rank almost never moved through courtly spaces alone. Their greetings were monitored, regulated, and, if necessary, cut short by an older aunt whose glare could curdle milk. If a young woman greeted a man too warmly, a sharp cough, or whispered, "That's enough, dear," often intervened before scandal could bloom. And yet, despite all these barriers, women still found ways to communicate power, charm, and authority through their limited gestures. A well-timed glance, a confident fan wave, a lingering finger on the edge of a wine goblet. If men used handshakes as verbal punctuation, women wrote entire chapters with the spaces between gestures. You, standing in this courtyard of velvet and scrutiny, get your chance. One of the ladies turns to you. She's older, stern-faced, with the kind of jewelry that says, "My family hasn't worked in 300 years. She extends 2 fingers. Here it is. The dainty handshake. You remove your glove, gently touch her fingertips with yours, and bow your head slightly. She nods, retracts her hand, and walks on without a word. You may have just passed a silent test, or failed it. It's hard to tell when the grading system is written in lace. Quirky historical note, in some parts of Europe, especially among female mystics or herbalists, women did use hand touching in ritualistic ways. A light clasp of the wrist, the laying of hands on the palm. It wasn't a greeting so much as a form of spiritual exchange. Of course, this was often misunderstood by others, especially the church, which viewed such gestures as dangerously pagan. So naturally, women kept it quiet. As with everything else, so now you know. Renaissance ladies didn't need elaborate grips or aggressive palm angles. Their greetings were smaller, subtler, but no less powerful. You could start a war with a handshake. A woman, she could end one with a nod. The evening deepens, stars blink cautiously overhead, and the air cools with a breeze that smells faintly of rosemary and overcooked lamb. You slip away from the festive hum of the main hall and find yourself drawn to a quiet corner of the estate, a cloistered garden, dimly lit by flickering lanterns. There, pacing in quiet conversation, are a handful of monks and church officials, their robes sweeping across the flagstones like whispers. And just when you think you're safe from the handshake wars, they clasp hands. Welcome to the sacred side of the handshake church. Approved grips, where gestures weren't just etiquette. They were theology, hierarchy, and sometimes low-key heresy prevention. Now, it's important to note that within the church, not all handshakes were equal. In fact, most clergy didn't engage in the handshake as we understand it today. Instead, their greetings, when involving hands, were steeped in ritual, scripture, and centuries of layered symbolism. The classic grip and pull handshake, that wasn't their style. Too secular, too sweaty. Instead, they practiced more symbolic touches, open palm blessings, 2 finger gestures, or the ceremonial hand clasp, known as the dextrarum unctio, a joining of right hands that had roots all the way back in ancient Roman betrothal rites. Historians still argue whether the church adapted this Roman tradition out of practicality, or if it was part of their broader campaign to co-opt every cool ritual in Europe. Either way, by the Renaissance, clergy handclasps were highly choreographed and deeply meaningful. In monastic communities, especially among Benedictines, greeting rituals often included bowing and the holy touch, a brief, reverent grasp of the other's hand accompanied by a whispered Latin blessing. Very hush-hush, very holy. Higher up the ladder, bishops, abbots, cardinals, the greetings got fancier. The bishop's grip, for example, involved a stylized palm hold where only the lower fingers made contact, allowing the upper hand to remain clean for making the sign of the cross. This was part theology, part hygiene, and all about status. Touch the wrong part of the bishop's hand. You might as well have tried to hug a statue. You wander closer now, ears perked, eyes on a small group of friars engaged in what looks like an extended series of mutual wrist pokes. Nope, not conflict. That's the fraternal clasp, often used by mendicant orders like L. Trong Lo Neg Tin Beam Pin In Kanan Tine Chat GPDYNI. The Franciscans and Dominicans. It's not a handshake in the classic sense. It's more of a supportive arm grasp, a gesture rooted in humility and mutual service. The idea wasn't to assert dominance or status, but to express brotherhood, a spiritual connection deeper than words. Your hand met theirs, but so did your soul, ideally. The grip was firm enough to feel human, but brief enough not to feel political. In monasteries, physical contact during greetings was often minimized altogether. Silence was prized, after all. Many monks greeted each other with a bowed head and a gentle hand over heart gesture, what some called the internal handshake. It was like saying, I greet you here, in intention, without needing to fumble with actual skin-to-skin contact. The church also added layers of hierarchy to who could greet whom and how. A cardinal might receive the extended hand of a noble, but return only a nod. A parish priest would touch the fingers of a bishop only if invited. Touching a pope's hand. Unthinkable. Unless it was to kiss his ring, and even then, you kissed the air above the ring, because actual contact was reserved for holy occasions. It's like trying to plug in a USB blindfolded. You had to know the right angle, or nothing happened. And the handshake as oath. That was big in ecclesiastical law. Sworn agreements, especially between clerics or in disputes overseen by the church, were sealed not with signatures, but with a clasp of hands, often witnessed by others and sometimes done in front of relics to make it extra binding. You weren't just offering your palm. You were calling down divine judgment if you broke your promise. It was the original terms and conditions checkbox, except it came with potential excommunication. Quirky historical tidbit. There's a 15th century account of a monk named Brother Ansbert who refused to shake anyone's hand for 20 years because he believed the devil could pass temptations through human contact. Instead, he bowed deeply and offered everyone dried lavender. People respected him. No one invited him to parties. The female clergy, or what few roles were permitted to women, had even more limited physical greeting customs. Nuns greeted one another with bows, touches to the shoulder, or crosses drawn in the air. A handshake with a nun was rare, and usually only occurred with abbesses in formal settings, still heavily scripted and never initiated by outsiders. In one convent, it said the only time two sisters clasped hands was during a silent vow renewal ceremony. The moment lasted seconds. The symbolism, forever. You now find yourself inadvertently standing near a bishop and a young scholar. They greet one another. The bishop offers 2 fingers. The scholar bows and lightly touches those fingers with both hands, head lowered, no words, just ritual. Then, the bishop gestures toward the sky, likely something about divine providence or the quality of the wine, and moves along. You've learned enough by now not to interfere, but the scene sticks with you, unlike the nobles with their games and their sleeve-based paranoia. The church's approach to hand contact feels more weighty. Less about performance, more about meaning. Or maybe it's just a different kind of performance, more theological, more choreographed, but still full of silent cues and invisible rules. And of course, there were heresies. Always heresies. Some fringe sects developed their own handshake rituals, often secretive and symbol-heavy. The Cathars reportedly used a double-handed clasp, followed by a shoulder tap, which to outsiders looked suspiciously like affection. The church cracked down on those hand conspiracies with predictable vigor. Even among the accepted orders, debates simmered. Should one grip the thumb or the palm during a confession greeting? Should abbots initiate contact, or was it prideful? Historians still argue whether the shift in postural greeting among Cistercians was about humility or a passive, aggressive jab at the Benedictines. Truly, Renaissance theology, where a pinky could launch a doctrinal schism. And as you step away from the cloister and into the night, the whispers of torchlight and monkish murmurs behind you, you're struck by the sheer variety of Renaissance hand greetings. Even within a single institution like the church, every motion had layers. Not just physical contact, but meaning, memory. You walk on, hands clasped behind your back, not out of fatigue, but reverence. Maybe even a little mimicry. Because sometimes the deepest handshake is the one that never happens at all. You return to the main hall just as a trumpet sounds. The kind of short, dramatic blast that suggests someone important is about to enter, or maybe just wants attention. The crowd parts like a reluctant soup, and in walks the person everyone has been avoiding accidentally touching all evening. Royalty. Oh yes. You're now in the glittering, tense orbit of royal shake protocol, a world where touching the wrong hand could get you exiled, scolded, or quietly ignored for the rest of your life. Forget everything you've learned so far. In royal circles, the handshake wasn't just rare. It was sacred, scheduled, and occasionally illegal. Let's be clear, monarchs didn't shake hands. Not the way others did. In fact, touching a royal hand without permission could be considered treasonous. That's right, an overenthusiastic greeting could technically count as a physical assault on the state. You'd better have a title, a scroll of approval, and a relative in the clergy just to get near the royal wrist. Instead, the greeting of royalty was all about being granted contact. If a king or queen extended their hand, you didn't shake it. You knelt, bowed, or curtsied. If permitted, you might kiss the ring. But even that was sometimes symbolic. More often, you kissed the air near the ring or let your lips hover a hair's breadth above it. Full lip to finger action. That was for coronations, oaths, and dangerously confident dukes. And yet, there were exceptions. Historians still argue whether Queen Elizabeth I ever shook hands. Some say she did with ambassadors. Briefly, delicately, and only under the eye of about 4 witnesses and a sweating herald. Others believe she favored the grace hover, where she would raise her hand slightly, allowing the other person to think they'd been allowed to shake it. Very queenly. Very confusing. Kings, on the other hand, occasionally clasped hands during ceremonial agreements. These weren't handshakes in the casual sense. They were contractual, symbolic, witnessed by nobles, sealed with Latin phrases, and sometimes followed by blessings or wine. For example, Henry VI was known to offer a palm during treaty negotiations, but only after removing a glove with theatrical care and placing it in the hands of his steward, as if to say, "Hold this. This next part is history." You, trying to blend into the velvet sea of nervous courtiers, observe as a line forms to greet the visiting monarch. Let's say it's King Alfonso, ruler of a small but very shiny kingdom. He's seated on a slightly raised platform, his hand resting lightly on an embroidered cushion. One by one, nobles approach, some bow. Some offer only their gaze. A select few, those with titles stacked like pastry towers, are given the nod. The royal nod is everything. If King Alfonso tilts his chin even slightly, that's your cue. You may approach, slowly. Respectfully? Eyes down but not groveling. When you're close enough, you wait. If the king lifts his hand, just barely, you move forward. No sudden motions. No enthusiastic gripping. Just the lightest touch of your fingers to his. If he holds still, you freeze. You do not reach out on your own. Doing so would be like trying to tickle a lion and hoping for laughs. And here's the kicker. Handshake length was closely monitored. Too short, and it was interpreted as disinterest. Too long, and you were either flirting or trying to absorb royal power through osmosis. Historians recount a famous Fox pass where a minor Dutch noble held Queen Margaret's hand for a full 5 seconds. He lingered. One account reads, "Like butter on a warm stone." She never spoke to him again. Even temperature mattered. Monarchs were known to warm their hands before public greetings to avoid the dreaded, clammy impression. Some had attendants whose job was literally to keep their hands pleasantly warm with fur, lined pouches, or discreet coals, because heaven forbid your subjects think you're human, and woe to the sweaty, palmed. You, dear traveler, must keep your hands dry, your eyes respectful, and your bow rehearsed. One ambassador in Prague was dismissed mid-greeting for having a visibly damp handshake. The queen's advisor simply whispered, "Humidity is not loyalty," and waved him away. There were also elaborate protocols about what happened after a royal handshake. You weren't allowed to wipe your hand. That was seen as insultingly symbolic, like scrubbing off divine essence. So, even if the royal hand had been dipped in oyster sauce, you'd better pretend it was holy water. More than one noble walked away from the throne room grinning politely with moist fingers and emotional damage. And for those rare souls allowed to initiate touch, say, a royal relative or a favorite advisor, even they performed the act with ritual precision. No firm grip, no wrist tilt, just a soft press, almost like laying a prayer upon the royal palm. It wasn't a greeting, it was a privilege. As the audience line dwindles, you watch as one overeager merchant, perhaps drunk on his own optimism, steps forward and offers a confident, fully extended hand. Gasps echo around the hall. King Alfonso blinks. He does not move. The merchant's hand hovers in the void like a goose trying to land on marble. After 3 agonizing seconds, the guards gently escort him sideways into obscurity. You wisely bow at a distance. No handshake today. But the lesson lingers. In the world of Renaissance royalty, touch was never casual. It was curated, choreographed, and controlled. A royal handshake wasn't a greeting. It was a message. I see you. You exist. For now, the royal encounter leaves a tingle in your spine, or maybe that's just leftover terror. Either way, you slip away from the grand hall, down a narrow corridor, where the marble gives way to polished wood and laughter echoes off old stone. You're headed to a part of the estate rarely visited by nobles, but absolutely swarming with nervous young men, the training wing. Welcome to Handshake School. Yes, it existed. Yes, it was as absurd as it sounds. In elite circles of the Renaissance, handshakes weren't learned at dinner tables or casually mimicked from dad. No, they were taught in structured, deliberate lessons alongside fencing, Latin, and how not to offend a Duke 101. Because a handshake wasn't just a greeting. It was a status signal, a political device, and a subtle performance test all in one. So naturally, the young elite had to practice. You step into a chamber lined with mannequins. Life-sized wooden figures, each dressed in varying layers of court fashion. Some wear velvet, others silk. A few have gloved hands outstretched at anatomically questionable angles. These are handshake dummies, designed to train boys in the fine art of greeting someone without accidentally declaring war. Across the room, a tutor stands beside a noble teenager whose nervous energy could power a small windmill. Palm downward, Viscount. Not like you're offering a meat pie. The boy adjusts. The dummy remains unimpressed. The tutor sighs. Training began young. Boys as young as 10 were taught the physical components: grip firmness, arm angle, wrist rotation. They practice on each other, on attendants, and on dummies designed to simulate a variety of social situations. Some even had spring, loaded arms that would resist or sag, forcing the student to adjust in real time. The Renaissance, where even handshakes fought back. Then came gesture drills. These weren't just about the physical contact. They included full greeting sequences. Approach. Pause. Eye contact. Glove removal. Offer. Withdraw. Step back. Smile or not smile, depending on court customs. Each sequence varied depending on rank, region, and occasion. It was a dance. A deadly boring, highly important dance. Historians still argue whether these schools were widespread or just a peculiar obsession among certain royal courts. But records from places like France, Savoy, and Aragon confirm that at least some noble academies included formal greeting instruction in their curriculum. One treatise, De Manuit Moribus, spends 42 pages discussing the symbolism of various hand positions, including diagrams so detailed they could double as palmistry charts. Quirky fact, in some Spanish academies, handshake class included scent pairing. That's right, students practiced matching their handshake style with appropriate glove perfumes. A strong class may warrant lavender. One manual reads, but for a soft greeting to a dowager duchess, clove or rose is more becoming. There's even a preserved test score sheet where a young marquise lost marks for choosing nutmeg in spring. Scandalous. And let's not forget the instructors. These were usually older courtiers, often retired diplomats or failed poets, who had witnessed enough handshake disasters to write tragic operas. Their patience was limited. Their standards high. One was known only as the clasper. His students feared him. He once failed a baron's son for shaking with his elbow, slightly bent. "Are you milking a cow?" he shouted. The boy cried. History judged. You peek in on another session. Two students approach each other with the cautious choreography of duelists. They pause, bow, remove their gloves in unison, then slowly extend their hands. The contact is precise, the grip measured, the eye contact slightly too intense. Too long, the instructor barks. You're not proposing marriage. The boys break contact instantly, as if burned. One mutters something about hiding in a hedge for the rest of the month. There were even ranked styles. A young noble was taught to memorize dozens of handshake variants: the scholar's grasp, the bishop's nod and clasp, the merchant's flex, the ambidextrous pivot. Each had its own context and consequence. One misused gesture could suggest arrogance or imply you thought someone was lower rank than they were. That got people hurt, or worse, talked about. Practice gloves were a thing too. Made from soft cloth or waxed leather, they were padded to simulate the feel of different real-world handshakes: sweaty, dry, gloved, bare. A young courtier was expected to recognize the greeting even blindfolded, a skill tested during surprise drills. You are meeting the Duchess of B, who prefers a dry palm and 3-finger clasp. Go. And because this is the Renaissance, there were dueling handshakes too. Yes, when political rivals greeted each other with exaggerated friendliness, it was sometimes called the velvet duel. A slightly too tight grip, a prolonged hold, a smile that didn't reach the eyes. It was all part of a handshake. As chess, match culture. Students were taught how to survive these encounters. Do not show pain. Do not look at your own hand. And if he squeezes, laugh. You begin to appreciate how deeply absurd and brilliant this all is. Something as simple as a hand to hand touch became a rite of passage, a subtle examination, an art form cloaked in formality. And unlike swordplay or politics, handshakes happened in full view every day. You had no excuse not to get it right. As the tutor dismisses his pupils, you see one boy practicing with a dummy one last time. He bows, removes his glove, extends his hand, grips gently, pauses, withdraws, all without a single word. And in that silence, you hear centuries of pressure. Night has fallen hard now, cloaking the city in velvet darkness. The torches are lower, casting long shadows that flicker and stretch like lazy ghosts. You find yourself following the sounds of clinking metal and quiet grunts into the barracks courtyard. It's training time for the knights, and while most are sparring or inspecting armor, a few are doing something very different. They're practicing handshakes while armed. Yes, welcome to the Renaissance's most impractical survival scenario. Shaking hands while holding sharp objects. This, you learn quickly, is not just about being friendly on the battlefield. It's about balance, diplomacy, and the sheer nerve of greeting someone with one hand while knowing the other could brain you with a mace. Among the warrior class, the handshake wasn't discarded because of danger. It was adapted to coexist with it. Picture it: two knights, both in partial armor, approach each other, swords on their hips, helmets tucked under one arm. They extend their gauntlet-free hands, not their weapon hands, never the sword hand, while subtly keeping their dominant arms poised to react. This greeting, often executed just before negotiations or duels, was as much about trust as it was about tension. Historians still debate whether these armored greetings were genuine signs of respect or just elaborate theater. Either way, they were common. Knights developed a special left handshake reserved for occasions where the right was otherwise engaged, usually in gripping a weapon or holding a horse. In some cultures, the left-handed greeting was actually considered more honorable because it implied that both men were equally vulnerable in that moment. But not all warriors agreed. In German lands, the tradition leaned toward the elbow clasp, where two knights would bump or grip forearms just below the armor plating. This was practical. You didn't have to remove your gauntlet, and symbolically powerful. It said, "I acknowledge your strength and your ability to crush me." And then there was the gauntlet touch. Not a handshake, per se, but a form of armored respect. A knight might gently tap the back of another's gauntlet before a joust, or at the start of a military council. Just a light clink, the sound echoing with layers of unspoken meaning, alliance, respect, readiness to die gloriously in matching tabards. You watch now as two young squires practice these moves. One wears a light chain shirt, the other has a practice blade strapped to his belt. They extend their hands awkwardly, trying to find the sweet spot between friendliness and not dropping anything important. Don't let go of your hilt. Their trainer mutters, "Unless you know he won't stab you. This isn't a dinner party." Of course, some knights completely rejected handshakes altogether. The famously grumpy Sir Hanno of Saxony refused to touch anyone's hand after a fellow knight accidentally cut his palm during a ceremonial clasp. From then on, Hanno greeted everyone with a stiff nod and a gauntlet slammed to the chest, a greeting that inspired fear, respect, and a few broken ribs. Still, formal occasions demanded the gesture. When treaties were signed or noble alliances forged, even knights had to shake hands, though usually only after a tense show of disarming. There's a vivid account of a knightly parley in Burgundy, where both parties removed their weapons, handed them to squires, and shook bare-handed, while 20 crossbowmen stood by just in case someone got creative. And here's a quirky little aside in Italy. Some knightly orders had coded handshakes. Think secret society, level stuff. A knight might offer 2 fingers instead of 4, or press the thumb in a certain rhythm to indicate allegiance to a particular brotherhood or faction. It was like Freemasonry, but with more horses and less secrecy about the swords. Women in armor, yes, they existed, had their own adaptations. Joan of Arc was known to clasp hands with fellow commanders before battle, using a firm grip and unwavering eye contact. One chronicler noted that her grip was strong as any man's, but more honest, a high compliment in a world where strength often came bundled with ego and halitosis. And let's not forget battlefield truces. Sometimes, mid-conflict, a ceasefire would be negotiated. The gesture, a handshake, usually preceded by a dramatic lowering of swords. One side would send an envoy forward, unarmed, palm raised. The other would do the same. They'd meet in the no man's land, clasp hands, and try not to flinch at the sound of swords being sheathed behind them. In that moment, the handshake wasn't just etiquette. It was hope. You're drawn now to a group of older knights seated on a bench near the training yard's edge. One of them is recounting a tale of a handshake given just before a duel. The 2 men knew only one would walk away. They clasped hands anyway. Because, he says with a crooked grin, if you're about to try and kill someone, the least you can do is say hello first. You chuckle, but the truth lingers. Among warriors, handshakes weren't mere gestures. They were challenges, promises, and farewells. You might be shaking a man's hand one moment and holding his sword the next. The grip carried it all. As the courtyard winds down and the night deepens, You realize shaking hands while armed wasn't about safety. It was about style, grace under literal pressure, and the unspoken truth that even in armor, humans still crave connection, even if it's just one hand reaching out past the steel. The moon is high now, casting its silver light across tiled rooftops and winking through stained glass like a sleepy god. You're not sure how many handshakes you've witnessed today, but your brain feels like it's been through a velvet-lined washing machine, and just when you think nothing more can surprise you, you hear it, a gasp, followed by the unmistakable sound of social catastrophe. Someone has attempted a double-handed handshake. You hurry toward the source of the commotion. A small drawing room where a diplomat from the Low Countries has just greeted a minor duke with a gesture so bold, so radically unfamiliar, that time itself seems to pause. Instead of the standard single handshake, he's used both hands, one gripping the duke's palm, the other lightly covering it. Maneuver that in today's world might say warmth or trust, or I've seen too many TED Talks. But here, in the Renaissance, scandal, you can feel the unease radiating off the crowd like heat from a loaf of guilt. The Duke stands frozen, hand-trapped in this strange sandwich of diplomacy, eyes darting, as if hoping someone will explain what's happening. His attendant shifts uncomfortably. A woman faints, or pretends to, out of politeness. Historians still argue over who first tried the double-handed grip. Some credit a merchant from Bruges known for his flair and fondness for spicy hugs. Others claim it was a Venetian actor turned envoy who misunderstood a religious gesture in Constantinople and just ran with it. But one thing's clear with it. The first person to bring it into formal court life did not go unpunished. At the time, the double-handed shake was not a gesture of warmth. It was an invasion. The second hand implied possession, dominance, maybe even pity. It violated the sacred neutrality of the handshake zone. In a world where every inch of wrist angle and grip strength was calculated, adding another hand was the equivalent of leaping onto the table during dinner and announcing you've rewritten the script. You watch as the diplomat realizes his mistake. Slowly, painfully, he peels his top hand away, as if removing a small hedgehog from the Duke's palm. He murmurs something that sounds like an apology, but could be a weather report. The Duke blinks twice and retreats with dignity and the speed of someone late for a dramatic sulk. This, of course, sparks an urgent round of etiquette recalibration. People murmur. Some try the double hand clasp experimentally on friends. A few fake cough into their gloves as an excuse not to touch anyone at all. The room becomes a laboratory of silent panic. Now here's the thing. Despite the chaos it caused, the double-handed handshake didn't disappear. In fact, over the next few decades, it began to evolve. While it never fully caught on in formal court settings, too intimate, too performative, it found a strange little home in backroom dealings, secret alliances, and emotionally intense negotiations. A double-handed grip, when used deliberately, could soften a tense moment, signal genuine solidarity, or express grief. Clergy began using it during confessions. Midwives used it with nervous fathers. Dying nobles clasped the hands of their heirs with both palms, as if passing on not just land and title, but feeling. Of course, it remained controversial. Some called it the grasp of guilt. Others referred to it as the pilgrim's palm, linking it to religious ceremonies and holy farewells. There's even a reference in a satirical play from 1572 where a noble is mocked for trying the double clutch on 3 different bishops and being slapped with a missile, and not all cultures viewed it the same. In some Slavic regions, the two-handed shake was considered deeply respectful, especially when done kneeling. In certain Swiss cantons, it was seen as the proper way to conclude a burial contract. But in England, still weird, still dangerous. Queen Elizabeth I reportedly declared, "If one hand fails, why trust the second?" A quote that likely made its way into at least 6 passive-aggressive letters that week. So what does it say, really? this double-handed gesture. You reflect now, wandering into the cool air of the courtyard again, your own hands tucked into your sleeves. It's vulnerable, a little needy, kind of dramatic, but honest. It tells the other person, I want you to feel this. And that, in the Renaissance, was either deeply moving or horrifying. You remember one more story, half legend, half gossip, of a prince who used the double-handed handshake during a treaty negotiation. He clasped the enemy commander's hand with both of his own, looked him square in the eye, and said nothing. The war ended the next day. Some say it was the handshake. Others say the food ran out. Historians still argue whether that was diplomacy or just hunger-driven affection. And so, as you consider your own hands, capable of carrying so much meaning with the lightest touch, you realize that even this strange, scandalous gesture found a way to survive. It didn't belong in grand courts or perfumed salons, but in quiet corners, in moments of truth, in the rare spaces where people reach not just to greet, but to hold. The double-handed handshake, Renaissance misfire turned secret code for those who dared to care a little more than expected. You've returned at last to the same stone square where our journey began. The light has changed. Morning now creeps into the corners of buildings, brushing rooftops with pale gold. There's a chill in the air, and the city seems to exhale. Sleeping less, noticing more. You pause beside a statue of some long, forgotten general whose grip, even in marble, seems just a little too enthusiastic. Fitting, because now, finally, it's time for the last chapter in our winding, weird, whisper-filled tale, the slow decline of the Renaissance handshake. After centuries of coded gestures, power grabs, perfumed fingers, and wristy politics, something started to shift. The Enlightenment was coming. Ideas were changing. People, imagine this, were beginning to value clarity over mystery, logic over performance. And with it, the art of the handshake started to get, well, simpler. Not overnight, of course. Ritual doesn't die easily. For a while, all the styles coexisted in chaotic harmony. Nobles still clung to their velvet traditions. Clergy stuck to their holy grips. Peasants kept nodding at each other like they were in on a joke the rest of Europe hadn't caught up to. But beneath it all, something new was creeping in, the idea of the handshake as a universal equalizer. Historians still argue whether this was a product of growing literacy, rising merchant classes, or just handshake fatigue. Maybe all three. What's certain is that by the late 1600s, a plainer, more straightforward handshake began to take root, especially in trade and diplomacy. You offered your hand. They took it. One shake. Done. No wrist angles. No glove theatrics. It was refreshingly boring. Part of this was driven by necessity. The Enlightenment brought new networks of communication. Scientific societies, republics, reform movements. People needed a greeting that didn't come with 4 pages of etiquette footnotes. A handshake became something anyone could do. Not because they were noble or chosen or carrying a dagger made of sapphire, but because they were present. You walk now through the awakening streets, past shopkeepers opening shutters, apprentices sweeping thresholds, and even, yes, a nobleman tipping his hat to a baker. Not shaking hands, just nodding. Times are changing. There's even a delightful bit of fringe trivia. One early scientific society in London allegedly required new members to perform a handshake test. Not for style, but for steadiness. For a trembling hand may signal an unsteady intellect, they wrote. Or possibly just too much coffee. Either way, the point was that handshakes were becoming practical, not performative. Even the church eased up. While some rituals remained formal, everyday clergy began adopting the common clasp, especially in Protestant regions. Gone were the days of the bishop's 3-finger hover or the sacred elbow pat. In came the pastor's handshake, firm, warm, and utterly unfragrant. Meanwhile, aristocrats clung to the past for as long as they could. There's a letter from a dowager duchess in 1710 complaining that her nephew greeted her with a common clasp, like a fishmonger, or worse, a lawyer. She refused to speak to him for 6 months, but the writing was on the wall, and probably on some well-folded Enlightenment pamphlets too. And what about the great double-handed shake? It didn't vanish. It simply retreated, rebranded. Today we call it heartfelt, sincere, occasionally overbearing. But it lives on, tucked into weddings, tearful goodbyes, or the moment when someone returns your lost dog. You reach the city's edge now, the sunrise bathing everything in the kind of light that makes even the pigeons look noble. A merchant passes you, nods, then, unexpectedly, extends a hand. You clasp it. One shake? No fanfare? No wrist check. Just a handshake. And just like that, all the layers, all the history. Cunning courtiers, dramatic gloves, heretical knuckle codes, they condense into this one moment. Two people. One gesture. It doesn't matter if you're royal or regular, if your sleeves hide daggers or crumbs, if you're saying hello, farewell, or I hope you didn't notice I forgot your name. The handshake remains simple, kind, a little awkward, and eternal. Now, as the day begins and you ease into stillness, let your breath slow. Your hands rest gently at your sides, empty of all the noise and performance we've left behind. You've traveled across centuries, touched fingertips with monarchs, monks, knights, and poets. You've gripped gauntlets, dodged glove challenges, and outwitted sleeve daggers. And through it all, you remained present. Curious, careful, quietly amused. Let the tension release from your wrists now. No more grip strength. No need to posture. The world of Renaissance etiquette, with all its velvet drama and perfumed rules, can drift into the background like incense on a breeze. The candlelight of memory softens. Those corridors lined with etiquette. Those courtyards heavy with protocol. They're still there, sure, but they're growing faint, like a dream losing detail as the sun rises. You're stepping away now, leaving the marble halls and creaking ballrooms, leaving the whispered judgments of ladies with rings, the huffing scholars with diagrams of wrists. And what you carry out with you is something simpler, the comfort of quiet connection, a gesture stripped of meaning until only its heartbeat remains. So breathe deeper. Slower, let your body sink. The world no longer needs you to perform. The handshake can wait. Good night, my friend.